The conventions are over, so bring on the polls. This time on Poll Hub, what difference did the quadrennial partisan festivals make? Depends on which poll you look at. So we're going to look at a bunch of them. Then we're honored to be one of a handful of polls being used to determine which candidates make it to the presidential debates this fall, but we still don't necessarily think it's a good idea to use polls this way. So we'll talk about it. So let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I am Miringoff, Director of Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So now that we're past the conventions, which were back-to-back, kind of rare and made for an interesting polling experience because you had the Democrats and the Republicans immediately, so everybody got into the field to get polling. There are a lot of polls out there, and before we talk about any individual one, I just want to kind of lay the groundwork here, the foundation, that in the poll averages, which there's Real Clear Politics and there's 538 are the two biggest averages, not very much has changed from before the conventions. So I just want to kind of set the stage there before we talk about individual polls, but different polls are showing different things, right?
Yeah, and I would just comment to say, from a numbers standpoint, it's almost as if the conventions not only were virtual, but they actually didn't exist altogether. And I think that, yeah, as you say, there are some differences, and I think we should dig down into those, because I think there was a sense just coming out of the convention that the pendulum had swung in Trump's direction, which it may have a tiny bit. But the word bounce, I think, is a great over-exaggeration. Strategically, we can talk also about whether we think the conventions accomplished things from a messaging standpoint that they want to do, that being different from having caused a big change in the numbers. I didn't see it. I don't think, Barb, you saw anything like that.
Well, before we just get into all the numbers, because you're right, Jay, what a slew of polls that were out this week. Usually Labor Day is the traditional start of the general election. And, these are all pre-Labor Day, post-convention polls. And I think everybody but us, we actually felt a little left out.
Saving the best for last.
Of course. But I was just, before we marched on to the bounce or non-bounce, do you think the fact that these conventions were virtual helped or hurt the proverbial bounce?
The pause here is, as Jay and I are both, I would say no.
You get that one, Lee.
I would say no, because the bounces have been vanishing over time, and I think they're a factor, or the absence of the polarization causes the absence. There are not a lot of voters who are shopping for a candidate at this point. I think the people who like the Democrats watch the Democratic convention. The people who like the Republicans like to watch the Republican convention. And then there's a group who just, people like us who like to watch stuff. So I think that, there was not that big up in the air group of voters who needed to be, convinced or persuaded.
Right.
So bounces have gone away for some time. I'm not sure the virtual convention is an excuse for the absence, or explains the absence.
Yeah, I think this is a bad year to determine whether a virtual convention is a good or a bad idea. But a couple of these polls, let's mention a couple of them. So Morning Consult and Yahoo News, YouGov both said that Biden's lead went down a fairly significant amount, 6 points.
And they were the first ones out.
They were the first ones out. University of Southern California poll, which has from 2016, a whole different backstory, showed Biden's lead increased. Emerson has Biden at 49, Trump at 47, which is about the closest anybody's seen. The Democracy Institute poll, which got a big play in a conservative newspaper in the UK, has Trump winning 48 to 45. There's really no other poll that shows that, and a bunch of state polls. But again, the RCP, Real Clear Poll, Real Clear Politics poll average, and 538, their average, essentially there was no movement, or incredibly small movement. You suggested perhaps, Lee, a little bit of a move towards Trump. But in these averages of all these polls, Trump came in behind by 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, and he left down by 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, maybe even more.
Yeah, so, yeah, and I think we should look at some of these polls because what happened then a little bit longer on the clock was a lot of the live interviewer, high quality polls stepped in, and that took away whatever little blip there was. But I just want to take a stab at one. I mean, I think people have talked, and we have, about the Rasmussen poll, and that's not one that's highly regarded. The Emerson poll, because on occasion they, quote, get it right, which is the old, the clock tells the right time twice a day kind
Stop
of.
clock, yeah.
Stop clock tells the right, my clock. Well, anyway.
Go ahead, Lee.
Apparently, Lee's only tells the correct time twice a day.
Remember where I should be on time. But the Emerson 2 points. Okay, if you look down into the numbers, look into the crosstab in that, it becomes very less believable or nutty, if you want to use the vernacular there. Yeah,
That's a technical
There are
term.
credibility issues.
The suburbs have.
What are you talking?
Well,
What are
the
you talking
suburbs.
about? Lee?
Biden up 16 points. In the cities, he's down 2 points. He's up 2 overall, but he's up 14 among people who are over 65. So, and
You're suggesting
it
it doesn't
adds up
add
to
up.
100, but it doesn't make much sense. And then you have, the Midwest and the South are better for him than for Biden than the Northeast. So enough said. Sometimes these things have to, pass the so-called smell test, and there's a lot of numbers in a lot of polls, and what are you going to believe, your own eyes or what the pollster tells you?
Yeah, and I think that is difficult. And you mentioned the fact that there is a host of different methodologies. Everybody pretty much came out after the conventions. The first ones were Morning Consult and Yahoo YouGov. Boy, that's a tough one.
The yayas.
And the yayas. They're not going to appreciate that.
Probably not, but hey, they put their names together. I didn't do it.
But those are both, both online efforts using panels. So they were the first out of the starting gate. And I think those are the two that also did show a slight move to the president, although it's not uncommon for online polls to show that, particularly when there's a fast turnaround. When they have a little bit longer time, a little bit longer field time to have people respond, they can become a little bit more representative, because we know that people who are online all the time aren't the same as people who only come on every now and then. But then there's a whole slew of polls that came out that are from the live interviewer group of polling, including the Fox poll. They actually did a number of states. So they did Arizona, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, and actually didn't show much of a difference from what we had shown, at least in Arizona and North Carolina, from just a couple of weeks ago. Were you guys surprised that the state stuff stayed as steady as the national polls did?
Not really, because I think the national polls are reflecting state polls maybe in a way that in 2016 was less the case. We've seen consistently in the good quality state polls throughout this cycle, throughout 2020, we've seen the good quality polls in the states reflecting the national polls in a way that I don't think we saw in 2016, or we didn't have good quality polls in 2016. So kudos for Fox getting into these states that are so important now, and to see that. I have a slightly different question, though, which is, regardless of what the good polls are showing, is this useful to either candidate for the narrative to be, oh, the race is tightening? Even if it's not tightening, if Trump goes out or Biden goes out every day and says it's tightening, does it actually help either one of them or both of them?
Well, it keeps the fundraising very robust, for lack of another thing. And I think, the Democrats are worried a little bit about complacency. They've been known to measure the drapes in the White House too soon, too often. I think Donald Trump is setting up the scenario that, regardless of the outcome, which he's sort of already intimated or said, that he's going to win, and he is reelected. So I think both of them sort of claiming that is not surprising, because they are all about motivating their bases. The fact that it gets closer does not move voters who are on the fence, that small, maybe 10%, but it does keep the base intact. And as I say, if you're into fundraising, nothing like your supporters feeling that this is not a runaway, because it isn't. I mean, it's we know that.
Look, there are so few voters that are on the table to be swayed one way or the other. When we look at any of these polls, the undecided number is low single digits. We ask another question, which is adding to the undecided, which is whether people are likely to change their mind, from the candidate that they already support. And we add all of that up, and we just get to 10, maybe 11, 12% of voters. And that number is smaller when you look at likely voters. So it's all about turnout. It's all about getting out the base for these candidates. I don't know if the race seeming close makes as big a difference, because you're either really enthusiastic and you love Donald Trump, or you are really enthusiastic because you hate Donald Trump. And, both groups really want to, voice their opinions on that. Right now, it's still a referendum on the president. It'll be interesting to see if that moves to other issues, particularly with the sense that there may be a vaccine around the corner, which the pandemic has certainly been an issue for the president. 4 in 10, almost 5 in 10 voters in a number of these, state polls and national polls, showing that that's a very significant concern, and people feeling that the president didn't step up.
I think in the conventions also, though, I think the Democrats were trying to introduce their ticket. It wasn't all about bashing Trump. It was also about telling us the character and qualities of Joe Biden and who Kamala Harris is. So I think that they probably did a good job doing that. Some of the polls had Biden's favorability up a little, and I think that that was indicative of that. I think the Republicans did a good job in introducing this new issue of law and order and crime and violence and all of those kinds of things. It seems to be not an effort to claim the economy, not an effort to redefine COVID-19, not an effort to redefine race relations, but to talk about riots and to pin that event or the support of such on Joe Biden. I thought they did better than that, doing that than they certainly have in the past with Beijing Biden and Sleepy Joe and the Trojan horse and all those other things that they have called him. Whether that sticks or not, remains to be seen. I think the debates are the next big events, I guess, coming up. And well, it's almost as if, I hate to say it, these conventions probably didn't happen. Is that possible?
Well, but hang on, let's just look forward for just a moment. Okay, we were inundated with polls this week. And this is not going to be the last week that we're inundated with polls. This took quite a while to dig all this up. Thank you, Amelia, and for us to go through all the methodology. Are there kind of any shortcuts to understanding what's going on besides going to Real Clear and looking at the average? Anything that folks should be thinking about when they're looking at these polls? Some going one way,
I'll give
some
you
going the other.
One quick take on that, and that is that likely voter models, which are now being used by most of the polls, typically show a Republican advantage slightly based on the demography of the Republican voters. Interestingly, in the Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Arizona polls that Fox just did, there was no difference, 1 point difference, I think, in one of them, between likely and registered voters. that would work against the Republicans down the road if that pattern holds. I know that's what we're going to be looking at our polls, and poll watchers, I think, would be well advised to look at that, as they are about the upcoming debates, which are, of course, the big event. The first one is September 29th, yes. And I'm thinking that with the debates, the question becomes, who is going to be at the table? We know who the moderators are, but who's going to be the candidates? And the Commission on Presidential Elections establishes certain criteria. So let's go through that really quickly, and then we're going to talk about that. So to make it into the debates, you have to have polls. You get picked as a poll, which has reliable frequency of polling and sample size used by the polling organization, soundness of survey methodology employed by those organizations, and longevity and reputation of the polling organizations. Now, in the top, Jay pointed out that we were very pleased to be the only college poll teamed up with different media sources. There are a total of 5 groups that are going to be looked at to see if a candidate has 15% and other things like they're in enough states to win the 270 electoral votes kinds of criteria. But are those, ABC, Washington Post, CNN, Fox, NBC, Wall Street Journal, and our partners with NPR, PBS, and Marist were selected as the 5 to be the determining factor as to who actually is going to be participating in these debates. The first one, I believe Chris Wallace will be moderating at the end of the month. So we're pleased by that. But then the question is asked, and I think we probably have answers. We're not usually big fans of using polls as criteria, and we've actually avoided during primaries using toss-up questions for the purpose of not being included in those calculations. And I have some opinions on the difference between debates during primaries and debates during the general election, and I'm more comfortable with this. Barb, do you want to take a swing at why debates
Well,
are
there's a
so
couple of
big?
things. I mean, I think that when you're looking at the primary season, that's a time where there are a lot of folks who are up and coming within each of the parties, can throw their hat in the ring, and can campaign. Do retail politics, go to Iowa, go to New Hampshire, less so, but can make a stab at a run, and at least put their positions and policies to the voters. And so one of the difficulties of having some sort of a cutoff at that point, and we've seen it in the last 2 cycles, where you just literally have 20 odd candidates in these that have decided to run for president in the early states, both on the Republican and Democrat side. And so how do you figure out who is going, who should be in a debate and who shouldn't be? Because there's a whole host of candidates that fall far below any kind of criteria that a poll can measure. The difference in a general election is that there are also certain much larger criteria that a candidate needs to meet. For instance, you mentioned, Lee, that they need to be on the ballot in enough states to actually be able to win 270 electoral votes. Now, those who support third-party candidates do speak to the fact that this certainly makes it very difficult to have any kind of candidacy from a third party. In fact, we call them third parties, kind of pushing them aside from the Democrat and Republican in this country, because we are really a two-party system, and it's very structured against having that kind of free-for-all that we see in other countries with parliamentary systems. So yes, the rules are stacked against third-party candidates, but in that sense, the overall criteria for participating in a presidential debate is something that has to be met with a very, very significant support around the country. So doing polls and saying that someone needs to have 15% support, I don't see as egregious, because of the fact that the idea is that you do have a few number of candidates, and in order to be part of these debates and not to distract, I think a candidate does need to show that they have some broad-based support across the country.
And minor party candidates are not showing much in the state polls.
Well, they haven't.
Not now,
I mean,
not
there
this
have
year,
been
not
examples
this year.
in the past. I mean, there have been examples in the past. Since certainly Perot during the Clinton Bush race in 1992 and 96 was very significant. John Anderson way back in the day. But this time around, Americans are pretty divided between Trump and Biden, as they were between Clinton and Trump 4 years ago. Although some of the Trump's win in a number of states, particularly Wisconsin, where he simply won by 23,000 votes, people have talked about the fact that even though the minor party candidates that were on the ballot got single digits, they certainly could have changed the outcome of the contest. But in this instance, 15% is a really, really, really steep bar for these third-party candidacies.
So we'll be watching the debates, not for who gets in, because I think we know who's going to get in, but for what perhaps they may do to the polls. And we'll talk about that on a future episode, to be sure. For this edition, however, we're going to bring it to a close and thank Mary Griffith, who's our executive producer, Casey Schaff, our editor, and Amelia Morel, our production assistant. Her helper assistant, canine production assistant, Hudson, was in the region, and I hope that the picture that was shared with us, we can put in the show notes. I think we can do that. I don't know. I'm hoping we can. This would be good to see Hudson connected directly to the Poll Hub Pod.
Well, we'll have to get his paw permission.
His paw mission.
Oh, I'm not going anywhere near that, but I will point out that the Roper Center does provide us a lot of great information, which we look at over time and seeing like convention bounces, and are they happening, or is this no longer a thing, and all of those kind of good things. So that is it. I should add one final comment and Mary's gonna look at me with meanness. Being part of,
They may just mute you, Lee.
Being part of the poll selection, being part of the committee criteria does not require us to do anything differently than we normally would do in our polls. The commission doesn't require that.
Correct. But if you do have any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out. We ask a lot of questions, some of them kind of silly, hopefully not too silly. We always think that questions are good, so reach out to us. We're at Marist Poll or Marist Poll on pretty much any place you can communicate on social media. We always like to plug our Marist Poll Academy. We have a bunch of students and interns that are actually going through this as we speak, and so you may see some changes in that as well as we get their feedback. And finally, please consider leaving a review. We prefer positive ones because that's how people can find us. But any opinion is definitely worthwhile. And while you're at it, please go ahead and subscribe. So stay safe, and we'll see you next time.